Hi, everybody. This is Josh After. Welcome to Sight, Sound, and Story Live, the stay-at-home edition. This has got to be our eighth or ninth live event, and they've all been great. And this one is no exception, so stay tuned. We're going to get to it right in just a couple seconds. But first, I want to thank our sponsors, as I always do, AJA, OWC, and American Cinema Editors, without whose support we could not do events like this. And also Jason Banky and Janet Dalton, who are behind the scenes making it all happen from a technical standpoint. They're telling me I have too much headroom right now, but I'm not going to adjust my shot, even though I probably should. Things like that. They've got my back all the time. So thanks, Janet and Jason. We are, it's funny that we're in the process of moving to a new office. It's going to be a new day and a new era for Manhattan Edit Workshop. So hence the mess behind me. And we hope to have everybody that wants to be back in a live classroom, learning very, very soon. On that note, it's the classroom where we teach so much of the buttons to push and the technical things and a lot of the how to do things. And those questions and those concepts so beautifully dovetail into an event like tonight, which is a lot of the creative decisions that are so connected to some very highly technical ones as well. VFX is always one of these things that sometimes it's more amazing the less you notice it. Sometimes it's great when it's just right up in your face. And we have some great examples of that kind of artistry tonight. So I appreciate you tuning in and watching. Next time we'll be doing it from a different place with a different, less messy background. We always have the possibility of technical issues. Knock wood, we haven't in the past couple of events, but if we do, we'll get the event back up and running immediately. For everyone watching, this is open to questions. So there's a chat box right next to your Vimeo window. I'd like to think if I went like that, I'd be pointing at it, but I have no idea because I'm not looking at it. But if you put questions in there, and if you want to actually be named in your questions, just type in a question or a comment. We can share that with the moderator and panelists, and we can get to a Q&A section toward the end of the show tonight. So without further ado, let's enjoy tonight's event. I want to introduce Ross Shain, Brigitte Bourque, and Eran Dinur. Thank you, guys. You can enable your videos and your audios, and we can pop on, and then I can pop off. So have a great event, guys. I'll see you at the end.
Yeah, if anyone is tuning in who does not know about the Manhattan Edit Workshop, it's definitely a very cool company that produces some great training and some great events. So I'm Ross Shain from Boris FX. I'm really pleased to join you guys tonight and be moderating this event, which is very near and dear to my heart. We're talking about visual effects. And I think what's going to be interesting here is we'll be talking to two very talented and experienced visual effects supervisors. But when we talk about visual effects, we're not necessarily talking about, Marvel films and lightning, and well, we might even see some lightning, but we're not necessarily talking about superhero films here. We're talking about mostly invisible effects and really sort of an art that helps tell the story. So I'm just really pleased to introduce both of you. So Brigitte Bourque, who is basically both a talented visual effects artist and supervisor. Brigitte has worked on some really famous films over the years, from The Planet of the Apes, Armageddon, Fast and Furious, Chronicles of Narnia, and X-Men, and more recently as a VFX supervisor on some TV shows like The Walking Dead, Empire, and 9/11. So Brigitte, great to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
And I'd also like to introduce Eran Dinur, who is a Emmy and VFS, VES, which is the Visual Effects Society, award-winning VFX supervisor. He's also written some interesting books about visual effects, which we might talk about later. Eran has worked on the Trial of the Chicago 7, Uncut Gems. That was one of my favorites last year. Ad Astra, The Greatest Showman, Wolf of Wall Street, and he is currently the head of 2D VFX at FuseFX. So Eran, welcome.
Hi, thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, and actually I did not mention that, Brigitte, you are VFX at FuseFX as well.
Correct.
So, but you guys have never actually met each other in person.
No, we've spoken. I'm working with some of his team over in New York. So I actually talk to New York every day.
And where are you talking to us from?
I'm in Los Angeles in our LA office.
And I'm in
Eran?
New York. I'm in the New York office.
Okay,
So
well, and I'm in New York in the Hudson Valley. So again, thanks for joining us. So to kick things off, I thought we would just look at some of your work, and then we, what we're going to do is kind of talk about the role of the VFX supervisor in film and television. So I'm going to share my screen, and I start with Brigitte. I'm going to start with playing a little bit of your reel, okay? So Brigitte, if you want to tell us what we're looking at here.
Yes, this was the first episode of 911 Lone Star. It kind of sets up this whole story, the backstory of everyone. This was a huge factory fire that we worked on. They did a lot of this practically, but a lot of this, as you can see, we added a lot of the smoke, the embers, some extra fire, blew some extra things up. And then here we have our tornado episode. Lone Star, every episode, something new and exciting happens. So we have to kind of change gears every single week. This one, we have the tornadoes. We did have, this year we had a volcano. Yeah, it's a fun show to work on. We really have to be, we never know what to expect when we're starting. We don't have a lot of time to turn it around. So it does make things pretty exciting, but it's a great show because there's a nice combination of practical and visual effects, and we work very close with our practical effects team to figure out who's going to do what for each episode. And then this was one of my favorites. Actually, was our wildfire that we just did this year. And this one was Empire. I worked many years on Empire. In the last year, I moved up to the visual effects supervisor. And this was also a very fun show. It was shot in Chicago.
Really, really nice work. And I think it will be fun to actually go back and look at some of those shots, step through them and learn a little bit more as we go through here. All right, so this is a film that Wolf of Wall Street that Eran was the visual effects supervisor.
So what we did here mostly was switch locations. This happened in several different places, but it was all shot in New York. Here, for example, we switched the location to the Hamptons. It wasn't shot there, so we had to change the environment to look more like the Hamptons while keeping the villa. This is a drone shot. Obviously, we also had to take out the drone operator. Here we, the lion is real, it's not CG. We had to add the office workers, so they shot the lion separately first with the trainer, and then we had to add the workers. This is a wedding that we kind of transported from Brooklyn or Long Island to actually a tropical island. So again, it was all about changing locations, a lot of matte painting, and some speed tree, animated trees. This one again is just replacing the background in the window. It's a tricky shot though, because we see it through the aquarium. This happens in London, but was shot again in Brooklyn. So we kept just the entrance and replaced the entire house to look like a London house. So again, all these visual effects were done to kind of make the production more efficient and less expensive by not transporting the entire production and the actors to London or to a tropical island. This happens in Geneva, and this one in Italy, which was really shot on a sound stage. And the main production supervisor here was Rob Legato, who's an Academy Award winning supervisor. And here we changed it to London by putting some known monuments in a shot that was shot in New York. We also had to fix the grass because the grass in London is nicer than New York. And finally, this is the final shot of the movie where, you know, they're playing tennis in prison. And we basically had to create the entire environment and recreate the whole tennis court because we also changed the camera motion, which Scorsese felt was too fast, which meant cutting out the actors and the extras and placing them back in the tennis court and then creating the entire environment as a matte painting and adding guards and so forth as separate elements. So there was very little CG here. It was a lot of matte painting.
You know, just looking at both of those two reels, I have a million questions for both of you. And I think it's going to be really fun to kind of get into that. But before we do that, I just thought maybe if you guys could share a little bit more about yourselves, and we'll start with Brigitte. You know, how did you get into the industry? You know, if you could just tell us a little bit about how you got interested in the film and in post world, and sort of your journey, that would be really interesting.
Well, I started in practical production. I'm from Florida. I started out as a script supervisor. And so I worked on set for a while. And then when I came out to Los Angeles, you know, when I studied in school, I studied film and history. There weren't any visual effects classes. There was no avenue I didn't even know about it really, to be honest, except for the optical area. When I came out after working a few movies on the set, I moved on to, I took classes actually. I just took a couple of classes just to get started, to learn what it was all about. And then from then on, I was lucky to get on a couple of films, work at some great companies. I learned a lot from them and just kept moving up from there.
When you say you took classes, I mean, you know, visual effects originally, obviously the term visual effects is very broad. You know, we're talking about practical effects, talking about optical printing, talking about all kinds of different techniques before everything became digital. What was your first exposure? You know, did you get into software, you know, particular tools?
Yes, the first class I took was actually Matador. It was at a company called Silicon Studios. The colleges weren't really teaching these classes yet, so they taught a variety of classes, everything from Matador to Cineon. Cineon was the thing at the time, Flame and Inferno, other classes like that. I actually, after I took a class or two there, I became a teaching assistant. So I started doing a little bit of teaching there, and then I was able to take more classes and keep moving on until I was able to move into a facility that was working on films.
Very cool. Go ahead.
It was a fun place to work. Actually, a lot of our students were people that were in the film industry that were retraining for one reason or another. Maybe they couldn't do their job anymore. Maybe they were on disability. They couldn't. Well, we had a lot of grips actually that were coming through the facility, learning visual effects. So it was fun to talk with all those people.
That's definitely interesting. I'm personally very familiar with Matador. I actually worked with Parallax when they first came out, and you know, for those who might not know, Matador was one of the first paint packages for digital film. It was the first like resolution independent paint. It was used by ILM and different companies back in the day. These softwares ran on Silicon graphics, right? So these were very expensive computers back in the day. So you literally would have to take a class. It's not like you would have an SGI at home, right?
No, there weren't a lot of avenues, but back then it was easy. It was a lot easier to get into companies on the ground floor and really learn on the job, which I was also lucky to be able to do.
And then how did you get your foot in the door with just by having some of these computer skills, you're able to sort of get your foot in the door?
Yes, it was, you know, back then it was kind of a fun time. visual effects was really expanding. There were a lot of companies. They desperately needed people to come in and work. So it was a lot easier. You didn't have a reel all the time. Sometimes there were people that were willing to bring you in and get you started. They were just desperate for people, and it was a really fun time to while we were in the school, because myself and the other teaching assistants, just to go out there and start exploring where we wanted to work or where we were going to work. It was a lot of fun. It was, I don't know, I get the impression it was a little easier to get your foot in the door back then than it is now, but maybe I'm not sure.
Interesting. We'll definitely talk about that, because I know that a lot of people are always, who watch these events, are very interested in, you know, the journey to you know, that people have taken and how to get into the industry. Very cool. And Eran, how about you? Where are you from originally? And would love to hear your sort of journey into where you know, how you got to where you are now.
I'm originally from Israel, and I was a musician. I wrote music for theater. I actually studied the music composition here in New York at Juilliard School. And I didn't even dream I'll do visual effects, or it was completely off my radar. Until at some point I downloaded a demo of a software called TrueSpace. It used to be a 3D software, doesn't exist anymore, and started playing with it. Got completely hooked, started teaching myself Maya and Max, and especially fell in love with creating CG environments. It was all a hobby back then. I used a software called Vue, which at the time ILM used on their Pirates of the Caribbean to create environments. And at some point, I guess they crossed my name or my work online and decided to bring me to ILM Singapore. They just started the Singapore branch of ILM, and they were looking for someone who could do that. And that was the big change of career in my life. Happened when I was about 40. I stopped writing music and started doing visual effects. I came into Singapore and they realized they don't really have any view environment work. On the other hand, they really needed compositors. So they asked me if I'd like to be a compositor, and I said, sure, what is that? So that just shows you how things kind of went very unexpectedly. So I learned compositing, realized that I enjoy doing it, and became a compositor there, then moved in to New York, was a senior compositor, compositing supervisor at a frame store in New York, and then joined Brainstorm, and later became a visual effects supervisor. In the past 10 years, I was working mainly as a VFX supervisor. So yeah, it's not a regular path, and I started late, but it was an exciting journey.
Well, it's certainly pretty cool that at 40 years old, you're able to reinvent yourself.
And move to another country with a family and 2 small children.
And you're self-taught. That's definitely interesting, you know, especially at a time where maybe, you know, there wasn't as much access to 3D software.
No, and I mainly, you know, there were no tutorials online. I mean, there wasn't even a fraction of what we have today. So I used to go and buy books, you know, real heavy books about Maya or Max, and sit in the theater rehearsals, and between playing cues and writing music, I would read another chapter of how to do something in Maya. So yeah.
Yeah, I do remember the days where books were, every software had a library of books. I think I might even have some back here.
Yeah.
Very cool. And you know, you mentioned 3D. I mean, how do you, now you're the 2D head of 2D. What's your relationship? I mean, are you spending more of your time thinking about 2D or 3D these days?
Well, I still love 3D, but I don't have the patience to wait until things render. I like the fact that it's faster with 2D, but honestly, you know, in the past 12 years, I was doing mostly compositing. And as a supervisor, the, you know, compositing tools are probably more useful to you because, you know, a lot of time I would just open up Nuke and do little tweaks on color just to try and get a look. So yeah, I'm not doing actively a lot of 3D now, but I am still very fond of 3D software that creates environments or natural elements. So for example, I am planning a training session at Fuse to teach some of the compers how to use SpeedTree, which is a 3D software, but is very useful for matte painting and for adding, elements, foliage and stuff like that. So I still have a fond place for 3D, but I'm not really doing it much anymore. Obviously, as a VFX supervisor, I have to deal with both.
Sure, sure. And I guess a question for really both of you is just, what can you tell us what the role of a VFX supervisor really is? I don't not necessarily think that everyone who's maybe watching might know exactly what a VFX soup does. I can say personally for myself, before I was doing the Boris FX software stuff, I was a visual effects supervisor on some commercials and music videos, but certainly never at the level of either of you. And I think that the role has probably changed a lot since I was doing it, in New York. So Brigitte, I'll start with you. What is your role? And if you could sort of explain, for example, on your current projects, what does the role entail?
Well, the first thing we do is the first thing is interacting with the client, find out what they need, what the time frame is, what the budgetary concerns are, and then from there it's figuring out how to actually do the work. We both juggle between 2D and 3D. We have to manage both sides to figure out, well, which is the proper way to go for the project and for the time that we have to do it. It's also managing the team, making sure you have the right artists with the right skill set. It's going back and forth with the client, the post group, to make sure that we're giving them what they want, make sure that they're giving us what we need. And then just seeing it through to the end. It could be developing the look, as well as the technique. Sometimes it's suggesting better ways of doing something than what they're asking for, or coming up with suggestions that is probably better for them than the way it's been laid out. And then just seeing it to the end and making sure that it's all done before it goes to the air.
So may I ask, who is the client? Is the client the production studio? Is it the director? Is it the editor? Is it all of the above? Who are you collaborating with?
It's a little bit of everybody, and sometimes it's a bit of a gray area. And I feel that every show there's a different group of people that you should go to first or second or what have you. For Lone Star, it's mostly the executive producer. The showrunner dictates, he comes up with a vision, he comes up with the script, what he wants to see. And then it's the executive producer is also one of the main directors. It's going back and forth with them to find out what they want, and then also going to the editorial team and find out, well, are we still doing that? Is it changed a little bit? Has something else come into play? And then that, of course, also has to go up to the showrunner, and then he has the final say of what things should look like, or if he wants something or doesn't want something. So it's not like a direct line to one person or one group. You kind of have to go separate ways and then kind of bring them all together to make sure that you're doing the right thing, or doing what they are envisioning for their show.
And at what point is, say, a script for an episode, at what point is it decided or broken down into which shots are actually effects shots, that have to be planned, that kind of thing?
Usually in the beginning, we'll start off by having production meetings where we go through the whole thing. And with COVID, we're doing all this on Zoom now, which is really nice because we all in the same room. We can break off into other rooms and discuss things. A lot of times, going through the script, we'll just listen to it and just kind of absorb what's going on. Especially with Lone Star, you never know what you're going to get per episode. And then it might be, then I might afterwards go and contact the effects people and ask them, what are you able to do? What are you going to do? What do we have time for? And then maybe it's a further discussion with the director to figure out what part we're going to do, or maybe we'll suggest, they'll say, oh, that's going to take 5 days to build this thing. And it's, well, let us do it because it'll be easier, and vice versa. We'll go back and forth. So it's very fluid. It's always very fluid. We're even while the episode is being filmed, I'm in constant conversation with the director, especially the effects people, to find out, well, I know you said you were going to do fire for this. Are you still able to do fire? Are we going to get fire? Can we have a little bit of fire? And then we just kind of build off of that. And we just make sure everyone else knows what we're talking about, so there's no surprises. But usually on this particular show, there are always a lot of surprises. We're working out who's doing what as they're filming. And it's just a process. It's just a process for this particular show. For Empire, it was a little bit more, it was definitely laid out in the beginning. We knew exactly what we were doing.
Yeah, I assume that the amount of practical effects in some of, in this current show is, like you say, a lot is changing all the time, right?
It is, the script changes. The script is also very fluid through this whole process. The edit is always fluid throughout the process. We just have to be ready for it, and we usually are. I started off on 911, and then I moved to Lone Star, so this is my 4th year in that franchise. So I'm a little more accustomed now to what's going to come our way. Maybe even sometimes before the editorial staff knows what's coming. I have a feeling what's going to happen.
And Eran, how about for you? Your role as a VFX supervisor, what does the role mean to you? And is there anything different in your experience as far as, when you're brought into a project, who you're collaborating, that kind of thing?
Yeah, there's some differences because most of my experience as VFX supervisor has been on film rather than TV, and there's some differences. In TV, you have the showrunner, you have a few more people that kind of are, decision makers. In film, the role of the director is very strong in most films. The type of films I worked on mostly are, let's say, more, I'd say, art films or films that have like low to medium budget, not the big, blockbusters that are pretty much run by the studio. So there is a stronger role for the director, and as a supervisor, I usually work very closely with the director. I see my role as a translator. We have two groups of people. We have the filmmakers and we have the artists, the CG and 2D artists, and they kind of speak different languages. They see things a little differently, and as a supervisor, your role is kind of to bridge this, understand what the filmmakers want, and bring that vision over and describe it in a more technical way that you can make it work with the artists. So I pretty much see it as that. I enjoyed working with some of these filmmakers a lot because they're very creative people, like Ari Aster or the Safdie brothers or James Gray. I also, one of the things I enjoyed the most working in film is working with very, very good cinematographers like Vittorio Storaro and Bruno Del Bonel and Darius Conji. These are people that you can learn so much from just by working with them and seeing them work. So there is a sort of satisfaction at being at both places at the same time. I like working with the artists. I like looking at stuff on the computer, but on the other hand, it's really satisfying to be part of the overall process and to be on set and see all these amazing people work together. So it's a very I'd say a very interesting role, and as Brigitte already described, it's challenging in the fact that you have to deal with a lot of different things happening at the same time and take a lot of different decisions and listen to different people and kind of accumulate everything and find solutions. Yes.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating career, I think, just to think about, it's really problem solving and a lot of I imagine a lot of people skills and negotiations and everything.
Yeah, it's interesting because in the studio things are very kind of, it's a different type of environment in terms of the interaction between these supervisors, comp supervisors, CG people, artists, and so forth. On the set, it's a completely different type of interaction. There's a lot of unwritten rules on how to behave, who to approach. People have a lot of pride in what they do, so you have to learn your way on the set. I came not from the filmmaking side, but from the artist side. So for me, the biggest challenge was to understand, those unwritten rules and kind of learn how to operate within that on-set environment.
That's actually really interesting, and this is a question for both of you. And then I definitely want to look at some more clips together because I think that will be really fun. But this, to play off what you just said, is I've met some. You mentioned Rob Legato, who we if everyone doesn't know, he's kind of famous in the visual effects world. But I know that he's very hands-on with cameras. He actually does a second unit direction. And some of the VFX soups that I've met come from that, the camera side. They might have more on-set experience. And how challenging is it for both of you, or how important is it for you to understand the world of the cinematographer and sort of relate to different lenses and different kind of that whole world?
I think it's important, and it is, you do learn a lot from being on set and talking to all these very talented people. To understand what the cinematographer has in mind is very important. It's, and also, and because it does affect your work a little bit, what kind of lens they choose may determine how much work you have. That's something that we're dealing with right now on the episode we're working on for next week. It is important, just because it just helps you in your work. It helps you understand, it helps you empathize more with what they're trying to get, and it makes it makes it a little bit easier to try to deliver what they expect. We might have discussions with a color correction with the DP because he has a certain vision. Lone Star has a look, a very stylized look, and sometimes what we do in post will affect that look. That's what we found out when we were doing that the very first episode in the feed and farm, the factory that blew up. We were adding a lot of smoke, and it wasn't affecting his. It was affecting his color correction that he chose in not the best way, and we had to go back and start adjusting stuff. Which was a little bit of a challenge because we were probably like 3 days before they were airing. So it is important to understand what they're doing, what they're looking for, what they have in mind, because what we do does affect the final product in their eyes as well.
And that just brings up like color managed workflows, and VFX has become a big thing in the last 4 or 5 years, right?
It has, and the nice thing about that, and the one nice thing about being on an episodic show is that, okay, we got over that hurdle, and now going forward, we got the final. Let's make sure that we have the right one and not just guessing. And we also have the final overall color correction that he was using for everything, and it really helps us balance our shots so that they'll look how he expects them to look. And it also helps us plan. I mean, we know we need to have, when it for example, for the smoke, we know whenever we are adding smoke, we have to be aware of the negative space that we have in there, as well as the area that we are smoking up. So it is important to know all these things.
Especially if, sorry, I was just going to say, especially if you're delivering episodic, the amount of shots that you're delivering, I'm sure is the quantity is quite large, right?
Yeah.
And Eran, and how about you? The sort of relationship to the camera and that kind of aspect of your job.
I remember coming to the eye session, the eye color session, and sitting there with Vittorio Storaro doing the color. And I mean, I was in awe with what he was doing, but then there was this shot where we replaced all the background. It was a green screen shot, created an entire environment, and he was doing a lot of color changes to different elements there. And I felt like we're losing realism because you can very easily, negate the work that the VFX people have done into a shot by starting changing the color, and that happened. And I said very delicately, Vittorio, do you think maybe that this is reducing the realism? And he looked at me and he said, it's not all about realism. And he was very, very true, because what he was doing was creating an emotional flow by doing the color. And I was just looking at it from the VFX supervisor point of view, which everything needs to look as real as possible. He was looking at it from an artistic and storytelling point of view, which is, this is a lot more important. So this kind of interaction, a lot of times you learn from it. I have to say that some cinematographers work much better with visual effects than others. It really depends on the attitude of the cinematographers. Some see it as like, we're going to shoot our shot and you do whatever you want with it, but we are going to do it the way we want. Others talk to you as they should, because they understand that eventually the VFX part will be an integral part of the shot and will affect how it looks eventually. And I think nowadays more and more cinematographers are aware of it, because sometimes what they shoot ends up looking completely different. So that interaction is changing, and I think the role of the cinematographer as far as visual effects is changing.
Very interesting. And one last question before we play a clip is what kind of tools might you bring to set? Are there tools that will help you? Do you take, if you're working with 3D artists, do you take, a lot of reference pictures for texturing or 3D scanning, this kind of thing? Either of you.
Okay, I'll go, I guess. It depends on the show. There were times where it was just me with nothing, if the shot did not require anything, but usually would have a camera, a tripod. One thing that is usually important to do is take HDRIs, spherical shots of the environment that then can be stitched and used by the CG department for lighting. Reference photography is very important. That's why on heavier shows we usually have a data wrangler, so another VFX person who is in charge of taking all the reference footage, taking measurements, talking to the camera people. The camera detail, the lens, and so forth is also very important to notate. This helps when you have a wrangler, because as a VFX supervisor, you can be with the director and the cinematographer. Things happen very fast on set, and then you can have a separate person that does all that. But I happen to do a lot of it myself on shows that didn't have enough budget for it. I even remember being on the sea in a tiny little boat when we shot a big sailboat off the coast of Cornwall for a TV series called The Sons of Liberty, a docu drama kind of. And I was in the other tiny little boat trying to take HDRIs as the boat is rocking, and nothing stabilizes and water flows into the land. So sometimes it's really kind of guerrilla warfare type of work, especially on lower budget movies.
For us, it's usually one person. If it's a very heavy effects episode, we might bring two of us. We kind of worked in tandem, Lone Star and 911. Well, we share plate supervisors, but a lot of times they have such a compressed schedule that I take as many reference pictures as I can. Not not knowing, sometimes not knowing if I need them or not. It's just better to have them. If I do know exactly what we're doing, what's going to happen. For example, when we had all these scorpions, there's really not a lot of time to get a lot of references. The lighting's always changing. If I stop the production to try to take reference pictures, I think they might kill me. So it's just a tremendous amount of pictures, measurements, references of what, you know, like these little critters were going to look like in a certain spot. And you know, our 3D team, they deliver. They use the material that I get them. Sometimes we're in such a hurry. Sometimes they'll ask for something that they didn't ask for on set. You just have to be ready for it. And sometimes we have, many times they double up their production. They might have two directors shooting at the same time, sharing the cameras. That's 5 cameras, a drone. It's a lot to keep track of, but we would just get as much information as we can, and then we just go from there.
It's just fascinating. I'd love to look at some more shots with you guys, because I think that that would be really interesting to our audience. So I think we'll go to Eran. Is there a particular project you'd like to share and we could sort of talk through, or should I pick? It's up to you.
I'll let you pick.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen, and maybe we'll talk about this one. Might just be fun because, like, a film like The Lost City of Z, for example, I think a lot of people would not necessarily think, you know, it's a historical drama, not drama, but there's obviously action, but I think there's a lot of shots that people might not think of as visual effects shots. So let me share my screen, and I'd love to hear more about that project.
Okay, so you can pause just so I can explain. This is a sequence where one of the guys falls. I mean, they're in you know, in the jungles of Brazil or Bolivia actually, and one of the guys falls. He gets tangled in a net, falls down. The hero is there too. The Percy Fawcett tries to manages to free himself. There is a bunch, you know, of piranhas kind of starting to eat them basically, and he manages to free himself, but the other guy dies at the end. This was shot actually in Belfast in an abandoned swimming pool, a diving pool that had depth in it. They created murky water by throwing in a whole, you know, tons of broccoli. Broccoli, yeah, if you kind of you know, the little pieces of the broccoli, you know, they make the water look kind of murky because it is supposed to be murky waters. But that caused a lot of issues because they were also using some turbines to move the water, to create some current to move the net, but the turbines got choked on the broccoli, so they ended up having one of the special effects guy literally free dive every time they screamed action, free dive in to kind of shake the net. We had these plates which were obviously very murky, and we had to add the piranhas. We did a whole research on piranhas. We even sent our CG supervisor to the New York Aquarium to shoot piranhas. They didn't really cooperate. They didn't move much. We wanted, you know, ferocious piranhas, and we got like really lazy ones in New York. But we studied footage, and, you know, these were all CG animated. But really the main challenge here was actually integrating those piranhas into this kind of really murky water environment, which is what you see here. You know, we start with the CG. They look pretty, but at the end, they're very motion blurred and almost hidden within that kind of, you know, layers of depth. So yeah, and, you know, with pixelation that we see on Zoom, it's even hard to see them.
And are the all the water bubbles and the debris, is that 3D as well?
The water, we added some debris. The water bubbles are mostly real. So we had to also integrate them with those bubbles. and the net, which was difficult. This was just a ship that we added. So we used the footage of another boat that was there, then created a CG ship. That's just an establishing shot of the travel we had. Um, this is the source of the river, which is, you know, waterfalls. We needed some active waterfalls. We wanted them a certain shape. We actually had a guy. So part of this stuff was shot in Colombia, in the Santa Marta area, which is unbelievably beautiful, but was very hard to shoot because of the conditions. But they didn't get waterfalls there, so they sent one of the same special effects guy that dived, that free dived. He's an adventurer. He literally traveled by foot to some remote waterfall and shot several elements that we used here, and the rest is a matte painting.
So this is a 2D construction essentially.
It's a 2D construction using footage and a bunch of, you know, separate elements to create a matte painting of the waterfall that they discover.
So very much like, you know, for the audience, this is something that maybe could have been created back in the day with sort of maybe optical printing and that kind of techniques, right?
Yeah, matte painting is a straight kind of continuation of the traditional matte painting style, where they would paint on glass panels and put them at certain distances from the camera to create parallax and a feeling of depth. We do the same digitally. We create 2D elements and place them on cards in 3D space. So it's the
Right.
same workflow.
Of course, the motion tracking is important.
Of course, yes. We had a lot of arrows that we had to create in CG and some water interaction. Here's some arrows hitting a boat. So, you know, we had to recreate, the boat is real, but we had to recreate it in CG so that we can have interaction of the arrows. These are also matte paintings of extending a field. This is a matte painting of, you know, one of the final shots in the movie, which is kind of surreal, but it's like, you know, opening up into the distance.
Again, great example of a shot that no one in the audience would ever think that this was a visual effects shot, right? They would just think it was sort of a grandiose, well executed shot.
Yeah, especially if you do some of it practically and then you just extend. Here, this was very important for James Gray, the director, to replicate exactly the RGS, or the Royal Geographical Society's building in London. So it's a matte painting. This is an arrival of a boat, which was also created not in CG, but as a matte painting. And this was a combination of CG, matte painting, and lots of crowd tiling, as you can see here. Because we had very few extras to shoot something that was pretty much improvised last moment. So we used a lot of crowd tiling. But basically, the whole day I was there shooting crowd tiles, each time moving them a little closer.
Excellent. Yeah, and I think that's really fascinating to me, is like we're sort of in the heyday of you know, TV, right? Where shows on Netflix that, you know, everything looks like feature films these days.
Yes.
And without people like you and the visual effects artists, you know, these stories couldn't really be told in the way that they're told right now, right? I think that's just a really interesting thing to think about, that even 10, 15 years ago, there were obviously historical, you know, recreations, but nothing like what we see these days.
Oh yeah, I think, you know, that it really enabled a lot of historical recreation. We do a lot of period changes in film, and there's a lot that happens on TV shows at Fuse. I'm sure Brigitte can talk about that, of just period cleanup or period reconstruction. Yes, it opens up a lot of possibilities and avenues for creators to do historical movies and dramas and TV series.
Very cool. Yeah, I love just being able to sort of scrub through and, you know, seeing the elements that that, you know, from the set. Very, very interesting. So I'm gonna Brigitte, how about we look at one of your other reels?
Sure. Let's look at the wildfire one. We being in Southern California, they frown upon the idea of creating real fires out. So a lot of this was just filming this location. You can see it's pretty a large area. They just shot, just to push the story along. We got the footage, and then we kind of, decided where the fire was going to be, except for that one. This one, if you could pause, this one is a car, an out of control car that comes out of nowhere. There are firefighters down below that are digging a fire line. So this is a great example of the combination of practical effects and visual effects. Obviously, they couldn't put fire everywhere, and because of this location, they were not allowed to put fire on the car at all. What they could give us is smoke coming out of the cab of the car, and that gave us great reference for putting our own fire, our own smoke, and everything that you see here, except for the fire and smoke on the car, is all 2D elements that we put in. So we were able to use matte painting, 2D elements, 3D smoke and fire, and you can keep going. And the other fun thing about this was we really got to drive the look of a lot of this. We had a vague idea of where the fire would be, but we decided, that's where the fire should be, out there. We had to kind of deconstruct the story because they shot so much footage, and decide where is the most optimal place to show this huge raging wildfire. And then here we have the helicopter flying through over the mountainside, and we added all the smoke and fire. They did have a massive amount of smoke machines there, but obviously you can't smoke up a whole mountainside. So that's kind of where we kind of took over, added our stuff, and just made it bigger. This was the one area, this right here, where they were able to use fire. They had a very safe location where they got permission. And these aren't uncontrolled fire. These are actually metal propane trees. They shot fire up through them, and they looked great.
I see. So what we're looking at, we're actually seeing like a sort of a representation of where the fire should be.
Yeah. So I mean, there were rudimentary shaped trees, but when you got a good look at them, you could tell that they were metal trees. But I mean, they did the job perfectly. They lit up the place. They gave a lot of interactive lighting, and then when we added our own fire, we put fire on top of it and all around it, and expanded the area considerably, and gave the whole feeling that they wanted of kind of being trapped in this firescape. So it was a very satisfying episode because we did get to drive the look, do our own sort of art direction.
So an episode like this, I mean, how long is that? What's the shoot like as far as duration, and then how long does your team have to turn around all these shots?
I'm almost afraid to say. The shoot, I mean, we were there, I believe they try to get 2 to 3 weeks, usually 2 weeks. Sometimes, like right now, I think they're down to a week and a half of shooting. This might have been a week and a half, maybe a little bit more, because we did have to cover a lot of areas. This episode covered a lot of geography. But we got to do this entire episode. I think we got a week and a half, 2 weeks to turn it around. So we really had to have our ducks in a row and be ready to just jump into it. Do a lot of prep work, a lot of guessing about what we're going to need. We took a look at the elements that we had. We got them all ready. This was heavily reliant on matte painting as well. A lot of those, there's a limitation to what you can do in 3D because it does take a long time. The car coming down the hill, that was 3D, and that took them, a lot of time to do that because it has to go through tracking. You have to object track the car and everything. the wide expansive looks of the mountains. A lot of that was matte painting. I even had the matte painters, you know, paint the clouds going up. And then we put moving elements on top of it. We kind of integrated. Sometimes we warped a little bit of the matte painting to give a little bit of movement to it. And it's all about turning it around in time. So, you know, there's a creative challenge to it, and there's also a technical challenge to it, and figuring out what is, and this is a perfect example. This is a lot of matte painting that went into that. But there's a challenge on both ends, creative and technical, to figure out the best way of doing something and the fastest way, because we don't have a lot of time to turn this around.
Another question for you, Brigitte, is are you bringing Nuke or compositing with you on set? Are you actually getting you know, any clips to test? Does that ever come into your workflow?
It does, and sometimes I will go to set just specifically to show the director something that we've come up with. Sometimes we'll do something on a still frame, or sometimes we will ask post to give us a clip to play with, and I will do that work. I don't do the work on set, but I'll bring it on my laptop and bring it in, or my iPad, and show them, and then we can continue the discussion. Having something to some visuals to look at and talk about is very helpful moving this forward. You know, and that's a lot of what we, besides showing them things, being on set, we do tell them what's possible, what's something we like to steer away from. And a lot of our conversations for this show center around, well, okay, this one is definitely going to have to be a 3D shot because the drone is doing what the drone will do. But sometimes we'll say, look, if we can just, this one shot here, I'm looking at the storyboard, if we could just keep this camera, if we can keep this in 2D, this would be a great help for make it more economical for you, and it will make it a little bit more doable for us. So there are those conversations. Sometimes it's suggesting shots. Sometimes it's coming up with a solution if they're giving us work. We had an episode last year where they didn't feel that this house was this house had fallen down, had collapsed in a tornado. They didn't feel it was enough area. They didn't feel like the house was destroyed enough. You know, the set needed extension. So, you know, they gave us this amount of work to do, and then I sat down and I figured out, you know, if we do this instead, this will give you the same feeling, yet you just cut out 40 shots. That was never budgeted for, and they didn't really expect. So there's a lot of conversations like that. We do actively try to help them as much as we can to make things doable for them in the time frame that we have. And this is very nice too. This was this whole tower. This was what you're looking at with this man. They built that on top of the they built that set on top of the parking structure at Fox Studios. So we had this beautiful sky, and sometimes when they were looking down, we'd have to replace the background. But they also had workers going up that pole. So from the long distance shots, there were actually people up there, like right there, that would represent our actors. And what we would do, we go out to set and we'll say, okay, we need something for them to hide behind. So therefore on the set piece, they built these big, if you could see at the top, they built these big dish towers on the set, but they didn't have it in the practical location. So we would add that to the practical location for them. So it's conversations like that going back and forth. I'm like, well, what can you do? And I would say, well, if you built this dish like this, it would be a lot easier for us to put that in, and things like that. And that starts in the tech scouting. That starts very early in the process.
Completely fascinating how many aspects the role of the VFX soup, interacts with in a project.
And this one was a particularly fun one because it involved not only a live volcano under the city of Austin, it also had a horde of scorpions that were driven up into this food truck to harass this young woman that had to be rescued. So it's never a dull moment on this show.
And as we're looking at this, I'm kind of curious for both of you, really. At what point, like, I'm going to pause just for a second because I don't want to miss anything. But the question is, you know, how do you interact with the editorial department? Because obviously there's tons and tons of footage being shot, and you obviously want, you know, the workflow needs to be efficient. You don't want to comp every, you know, you don't want to comp more than than you have to. So at what point, how does the interaction happen between the offline edit and visual effects?
Well, they usually start cutting, and when they're pretty confident that what they've cut in is going to be in the show, they pass it off. But so that's when you get into the conversation of asking them, look, I know if you could just give us a little bit of something so we can start working on it. And that's why it's really important to keep an eye on what is going to be a visual effects and what is not. And you know, and for this one, for this example, this we went back and forth trying to figure out how to get all these scorpions, and obviously they're 3D, but the scorpions on top of that, when you looked up into the skylight, those were little toy scorpions that the director had the special effects guy tie strings to them and just kind of yank them across. You could see some of them there, and then of course we, you know, they said, well, that's a lot to make all of these visual effects shots. And I said, well, you know what we can do? And we went back and forth. We said, we're going to render out an element of just shadows of these things, and we're going to track them in every shot. So we created our own element, and we helped them instead of settling for something they weren't quite happy with. We're having a couple of the scorpions up there. We gave them a solution that allowed them to have the scorpions all over the place on the roof as well as the floor without without breaking the bank.
This is what we did in New York. I appreciate.
Yes, yeah, and you know, another thing too, the ending of this one, well, I don't remember, it was the middle of it. The volcano, you know, they are trying to keep their budgets in line, and they might say, well, just put a fireball in here, but then I might say, well, you know, let me do a matte painting and let me, you know, and I'll show them something and say, look, this is going to look so much better. Let me do this. And it's a lot of back and forth that way. And this, if you go back, and this was an interesting one on set, those flaming balls that were flying through the air, they had some of those were practical, but they didn't have enough of them. So we were going to shoot elements, you know, with the special effects team, but we just didn't have the time for it. So we just went searching for elements, and we found that, and that kept it out of 3D and kept it in 2D. And we're able to make it, you know, keep it all these shots in 2D. So it's a lot of that going back and forth. It's keeping them in the know of what I'm thinking of doing, you know, and what they're thinking of doing. But the goal is to push the story forward. It's knowing what the story is, and all these effects are just to tell the story. They're not, you know, they're not for the effects alone.
I can't help but think, looking at all this footage, how much roto is involved at this point.
Well,
is roto?
it wasn't a lot because
No?
we first thing we do is we put those flaming balls flying in first, and then we did the roto, so we would know we wouldn't have to roto the whole thing.
Okay. Yeah.
So, you know, it's also being, you know, it's also planning things out carefully. You know, making people rush to get everything placed in the right area, and then turn around and start getting, you know, get the roto going. Sometimes we don't have time for that. Sometimes we got to get the roto started ahead of time, but you know, that's, like you said, that's a lot of roto. We didn't want to roto all those guys.
And that's a great example, though, of the consideration that you have to be thinking of, right? Of, you know,
absolutely.
It's like,
and sometimes it's like they'll say, we'll put fireballs here coming from left to right, and I'll say, well, how about if we come from here to here, because that's a lot less roto. And usually I say, oh yeah, that's fine. So there's a lot of, there's always a constant conversation going on with our team and theirs.
So having that experience as a compositor is like totally essential.
It, you know, sometimes it is when you're on set. I mean, the easiest or the most crucial part is imagining doing the shot yourself. Well, what do I want if I had to do this shot? And then you just, you know, and that's how you guide what you advise and and the elements that you take. And this one was this was one of my favorite ones, just because it came to all the all the elements came together so well. They shot this. They were very excited about it. It was pitch black back there, which I was thrilled about, because I could just take stock footage and stick it in the background, and then find some stock footage of birds and put it in there backlit. And it turned out to be a really nice shot. That is not a wildfire, actually. That is, I'm sorry, that is not a volcano. This was at the end of the volcano show, but this was a teaser shot for the next one, which was the wildfire.
Very cool. Very cool stuff here. All right, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. I'll ask you, Eran, first, if you could work with any director, who would that be?
Oh, you know, I'd love to work with the Safdie brothers again. I mean, I enjoy working with all directors. With them, it was a really fun ride, crazy ride. I mean, I wish we had time to look at the Uncut Gems, just because, you know, it was a really unusual, interesting, creative work with them. They are amazingly creative, smart, and have all.
Well, if you're going to talk about it, let's actually do it. Yeah, why not? I think, you know, it's fun to look at this stuff, and hopefully the audience is hanging with us. So I'm just gonna share my screen as you set it up.
Yeah, what we did there was we did the opening credit sequence and the ending credit sequence. And the idea, basically, when I first met with the Safdie brothers, they came and said, okay, we have this idea of the gemstone, the guy looking at the gemstone, the camera literally going inside the gemstone, traveling through the imaginary world within the gemstone, then somehow ending up in Adam Sandler's colon during a colonoscopy that we then see on at the screen of the you know, there were so many challenges here. Obviously, we had to design that interior of the gem as a CG environment. If you can stop right here, you know, the idea was to create something that does not exist, because obviously we cannot go with a camera inside a gem. So it was a little bit like those shows about the interior of the body, only that was the interior of a gem. We did look at some amazing photography, microscopic photography by an artist named Danny Sanchez, who actually manages to shoot microscopic images within a gem. We used that as inspiration and basically created a CG environment. But some of the hardest things were to actually tie that journey inside the CG environment into the real footage. The starting footage where we go closer to the gemstone, which is real, and then the end footage where we actually go into a footage of a real colonoscopy. So going in and out of that was a very interesting experience. So this is all, you know, we're using CG here with a lot of subsurface scattering, which gives it that kind of, you know, kind of translucent sense. We designed different worlds, and then Josh Safdie, who was in charge of that, kind of picked the worlds that he liked the most. These are some of the images that we used as reference. These are by Gubelin, I believe, which are pretty old. Images of actually inside gemstones. We developed some procedural kind of modeling techniques to create elements and these environments, and, you know, did some tests to give it the kind of fleshy look. Here we use, you know, some melting techniques to deform the environments. Here we also use volumetrics in CG. And these are some of the earlier tests that we did. That a lot of it didn't end up, but they just look nice. So we added them to the, but they were the first tests and development of the environments. And we used a lot of lights to create this kind of colorful environment that the camera travels through. Now, this is the opening shot, and this is real, and the camera is approaching this gem prop. And at some point, we had to take over the camera and kind of seamlessly continue as if we're going inside here, which, you know, was a cheat, of course. So this is showing how we blended the CG with the real footage so that we can kind of seamlessly go inside. And now we're in this volumetric environment. This is a different part of the journey as we travel. So what we call this the tunnel. And this is towards the end of the tunnel. You can see that it becomes a bit more like flesh, wetter. And at some point here, we use, some tricks to kind of blend in with the footage of the colonoscopy, which was real. And then, we end up on the screen, and this is Adam Sandler there on the bed.
Yeah, it's quite an opening to a film.
Yeah, and these are also different views of that. And in the ending, which we don't see here because they didn't want us to show it, but now I guess I can do spoilers because the film has been out for a while. He is shot. So at the very end, we again go close into the bullet wound. We go inside the bullet wound, and we find ourselves back in this imaginary environment. It was a really interesting experience. It was difficult, but I really enjoyed working with these brothers.
What I've heard around about the Safdie brothers is that they're very much like run and gun kind of style of shooting, and that they actually, they use a lot of people who are not necessarily professional actors.
Totally. It's amazing. They surround themselves. A lot of the actors are not actors. They're real people, and they have this knack of finding people that are just like the exact character. And since all this is about people who deal with diamonds, it's kind of, grungy New York people who sell and buy diamonds. They actually researched this area for several years, and they became friends with people who do this for real, and they are actually in the movie as characters. And I remember being on set sometimes. There's also thugs there, which were literally like real ones. There was no difference there between the shooting and behind and before and after the shooting. So they would say cut, and they would still behave the same way as they were in the show. So there was no acting there. It was all real. Yes, it was a very interesting experience. Definitely unusual.
Very interesting. Yeah, no, that's very cool. And Brigitte, how about you? Is there a particular director or type of project that you would like to work on in the future?
I would like to work on historical pieces. I'm interested in that. I'm also interested in shows like if I had to pick a director, I would say Wes Anderson, and primarily just because of the style and the look that he has. Yeah. And I'm also, I'm very interested in taking our visual effects and making them conform to that idea of style that certain directors have. I think it's very interesting, and it's a bit of a challenge.
That's kind of definitely interesting aspect too, is like working with the set directors and the art directors of a film, and like you say, kind of might not be realism. It might be a sort of a way to incorporate into a set style. Would be very challenging.
Yeah, because not all visual effects have to be, they have to be realistic. They can, like what he does with his films. There's a hyper realism to it that I always find very interesting. You like Life Aquatic. You look how fun some of those effects are, and they're effects because you can tell. But it's very important to the story, and it's almost important that they are like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very interesting.
Yeah, no, I'm a huge fan, especially even of the stop motion stuff that he's been doing.
Oh, I love that. Yes, I watch that with my kids over and over again. Fantastic.
And I think he's working. I think they're working on a new stop motion. I believe. I forget what the title is, but yeah. So maybe just to try to wrap this up, and I really appreciate both of your time. And I think it's just fascinating for me as someone who's working on the software side of things and working, on the periphery of the industry, but it's really fascinating to sort of see the behind the scenes and to hear from you. So thank you so much. One last question I have is sort of about the future. I think in the last year, really, year and a half, 2 years, we've heard so much about The Mandalorian. We've heard about this sort of trend of virtual production, which to me means two things. One is the idea of shooting rather than in a green screen set, shooting in front of LED screens. But then also another big aspect of that is basically more trying to basically do more in-camera visual effects, right? With like real time, generating these backgrounds in real time versus the 2D matte painting kind of concept that we've talked about. Just curious what both of your thoughts are. Do you look forward to this? Do you think this is a trend, or do you think it's here to stay? You know, very interested in what you guys have to say.
I'm pretty excited about it. I do want to see, I do want to work more in virtual production. I think once it's not so expensive, it'll put it within reach of more productions. I think that's when you really, when I will probably be more likely to experience it. But I think it's a great idea. I love the idea. I've liked what I've seen. I've talked to people that have worked in it. FuseFX is also doing their own work in that area as well, and I'm very excited to see where that goes, because it's another tool in your kit. You can offer this to your client as a solution to do something, and it's a positive. It's positive for everyone.
Especially maybe in this COVID world that we've been living in, that the idea that smaller crews maybe.
Sure, and in being on set, you hear when they're talking about logistics and trying to move this entire crew from one place to another, and it would be easier. It certainly would be easier to have a lot more work on a stage.
One thing that's very interesting to me is the idea that they're trying to do more visual effects in camera, but then the kind of talent that might be necessary to have on set is kind of like 3D animators and post people who are driving those Unreal Engine, based tools. So it's kind of interesting that maybe in the old days you'd have like practical effects, but now it's like a different set of skills might be on set. And Eran, what's your take on it, especially since you come from a bit more of the 3D background, maybe?
Well, it's exciting. It opens up a lot of possibilities. The fact that the actors are lit by the environment rather than by a green screen. Obviously, there is a lot of advantages there. It's still not, my hope is that some days we'll have real, environments where the actors can actually step into. It's still a background, so limited in that sense. Also, LED screens are, not as flexible and easy to carry around as a green screen, obviously. So it applies, it's a more expensive way of doing things. But I'm definitely sure that this is going to become more and more a norm for a lot of productions. Right now, it doesn't always work perfect. We did have shots that were shot on an LED screens where we had to fix it because something went wrong. So we had to roto the people and replace them. But eventually, I think as prices will go down, it will also be seen more and more in lower budget films as a great way of putting backgrounds that are more interactive and saving work down the line for VFX.
Yeah, no, it's very, very interesting, that's come about. And I've heard that there's more of the traditional sound stages are beginning to put in this technology as well, right?
Yeah, and my hope though is, the one thing that I think will really revolutionize our world or work is when they will have cameras that will be able to capture depth on a per pixel accurate. I mean, there's already been developments in there, but it didn't reach to a point where you can have a camera that's affordable enough for production to have that can capture along with the color picture, can capture depth, but very accurately on a per pixel level. When we have that, when we will have that, and I'm sure we will, then we'll be able to almost do anything in post-production or visual effects, because we can remove people who are a certain distance from the camera, place objects at a certain distance. We will not need, roto the same way as we need now, or green screens. And I'm really looking forward to that development to finally come in.
Yeah, I remember there was maybe a trade show about 3 years ago where they, a company that's probably no longer in existence, but they were demoing a camera that could capture depth, but the camera itself was as big as a truck, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it's very interesting what what the future holds for capturing depth. Absolutely. At this point, I think we have some questions from the audience, so I'm just going to kind of go through a couple of the quick questions. So what question here is how much visual effects is used in nonfiction films, and what kinds? What's your take on that? Nonfiction, like documentary. Have either of you guys worked in a nonfiction project?
I haven't. A documentary?
Well, nonfiction, I guess, is the question.
I have not worked on a documentary.
I worked on one project a long time ago. It was on Siegfried and Roy, and it was full of visual effects. It was a bit painful because it was a long time ago, and they decided to do it in 4K, and this was back when our machines just couldn't handle it very well. So it depends on the documentary. Yeah, there could be a lot of visual effects, or there could just be the seamless visual effects you were talking about, where they're fixing something. Maybe guys in the background, you got to paint them out.
I know from experience as well that maybe it's not the same kind of visual effects as we've been talking here with a lot of VFX supervision, but certainly the amount of work that is done in post on documentaries is huge, whether it's restoring film or, just finishing, which is color correction, but it's not just color correction, as we know, plenty of post-production visual effects techniques.
Yeah, we worked on series like The Man Who Built America, which are basically documentary series that do reconstruction of certain scenes. And obviously their visual effects play a great role, because you can reconstruct, historical events using visual effects. So that I'd guess that is nonfiction in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. Recreation, certainly. I have a friend who's a director who was doing a film about the Kennedy assassination, and there's lots of very interesting ideas. Here's a question for you, Eran. You mentioned earlier that when working on set, there's unwritten rules that interaction with the camera crew. Can you give us any examples?
Well, first of all, as it's very rigid in terms of structure, very hierarchical. Oh, I can't say that word. Sorry, it's in English. Hierarchy. So, every department has a head of department, and there's also a lot of rules that have to do with unions. So you cannot touch anything. For example, if you are like me as a visual effects supervisor, I see a chair that's standing in the wrong place. My, instinct was to just go and move it so that it doesn't ruin the shot. And that would be a very bad move, because there is a person and it's their role to move that chair. So these kind of rules for someone from the outside are hard to understand. Also, how obviously it's like a small army on set, and there has to be this kind of very strong organization. So the DP, the director of photography, usually they have their team, and you have to let them work with the team. If you have to ask a question, you should know where to go to. There's a lot of sensitivity on set, and yeah, that's part of it.
Excellent. Brigitte, here's a question that a viewer named Brian asks is, can you tell me what different roles within a visual effects organization might be? Like, how are the roles broken up? What are the titles? Compositor, prep, 3D animation, just kind
There's
of like,
so many of them. There's, you know, in compositing alone, you have, well, the visual effects supervisor is runs everything, and then you have under that you'll have a comp supervisor. He's kind of like second in command, or she can, you know, helps with the team. They might set up shots. They might help with look dev. And then you have your lead artists. That's someone that you can always rely on to take, you know, to take the lead on a sequence, and then have other artists kind of follow that lead to make it done. On the CG side, you have the CG supervisor. It's kind of like the comp supervisor's counterpart, and also the visual effects supervisor's counterpart. And under that, you might have the modelers, you might have the effects supervisor who runs his own team. And even in that organization, you might have specialty people. When we were working on Turn, we had a lot of ships. So we had someone who was in charge of cloth simulation. You have somebody that is in charge of crowds that create and animate the 3D crowds that you might use for maybe, for example, an audience scene or a crowd that you're not, you know, you can't have a lot of people, you want to duplicate it. There's the tracking department. You have the head of tracking. And who else am I forgetting?
Oh, there's riggers, the ones who
Yes.
do the rig. There's animators who animate. There's matte painters who will do the matte painting. There's a lot of different roles and different tasks.
Yeah, and even in a matte painting alone, you have the artistic director, and then you have the manager. Yeah, the list is endless. There's lots of places to find a home at in visual effects.
it really is an army, isn't it?
It is. It's almost like an invisible army. A lot of times the clients don't realize how many people you have putting all this together.
You see that when you look at the end credits of like a Marvel movie, and you see literally close to 1,000 people there listed, and it's not even all of them because there's not enough space on the roller.
That's true. Yeah.
I have a great question that comes to mind is when I watch the end credits, how come the guys who drive the trucks get their own credit, whereas the you know, some of the animators or VFX artists are buried in the long list?
The guys who drive the trucks have a union.
Exactly.
Visual effects does not. That's why we were at the end.
And kind of teeing off that the very last question I'll ask you guys is for someone who's starting out in the VFX industry today, you know, what softwares would you recommend learning, and you know, how would you go about getting into the industry?
I appreciate you.
Well, when I got into the industry, I mean, it seemed like a lot of my colleagues, we came from so many different areas. Nowadays, a lot of our young artists, they come up through the schools. Schools are teaching that, and they're teaching it very well. I mean, there's so much, like Eran was saying, there's so much information on the internet that I think research is the best way to go about to figure out where you want to get a start. And I've seen a lot of people move around a lot. You know, they've changed hats. I've had plenty of producers that used to be compositors, and I have, you know, I've known matte painters that started as producers. It's just getting in and exploring what you're interested in, and then going from there.
Eran, anything to add to that?
Specifically about specific software, well, I think it's really important to have some experience with compositing, and that could be After Effects or Nuke. I don't think the software itself matters so much as the practice and understanding what goes on. And if that person is interested in or wants to be in CG or 3D, just adopt one of those, you know, learn one of the main CG software like Maya or Max or even Cinema 4D. These are the, you know, let's say the three big ones. I don't put a lot of importance on the software itself because it's about understanding visually and technically the process, and then you can just switch to another software. It's all just buttons.
So focusing on the foundations.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
There were, you know, there was a time where every facility had their own compositing package, and a lot of us would go from film to film at different facilities, and you just had to know the techniques of compositing, and you had to be ready to learn a new program or switch programs. ILM had their own, Rhythm and Hughes had their own, Cinecide, of course, had Cineon. And with Digital Domain started, they had Nuke. They're the ones that started Nuke. So it's only recently that there's one that everyone's using the same compositing package. So you just really have to be prepared to change. For a while it was Shake, and now it's Nuke.
Right.
Yeah.
So it is pretty safe to say that Nuke is the default package for
now, yeah.
high end, right? Yeah.
For the high-end visual effects, yeah, it's After Effects is used widely in in
Absolutely.
design and commercials and so forth.
But it has its strengths. I mean, we do have times where we have an artist that knows After Effects and might use it.
Yeah, I think that generally software and visual effects is all the different software they're now basically very similar to each other, so they all do the same thing. Yeah, so there's not a huge importance anymore on what you're using. It used to be a lot more important that you knew Softimage, when Softimage was the software. Nowadays, it's one of them, you probably can deal with others.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think to add to that, from my perspective, just to share that, even a software like Nuke from the Foundry, they have non-commercial versions, and they also have, I think it's called Nuke Indie. So the companies are made these tools more available, and then Blackmagic Fusion, for example, has a free version, I believe, so or quite affordable. So I think we're at a point now where it's not like the tools are exclusive or not accessible, right? So yeah, I think the tools that you guys mentioned definitely important. Well, I think just for time, we could go on for so long. I mean, I again, it fascinates me to see your work and for you guys to share with us, your perspective and your careers. So thank you so much for joining us today. And if Josh Apter is here with us, I think I'm going to turn it back to you, Josh. And
I never left. I've been here the whole time.
But hopefully it was interesting to you on your end. And just want to thank you, the Manhattan Edit Workshop for having us. So thank you, Josh.
Yes, I can't thank you enough, Brigitte, Eran, and Ross, for sharing your time and your expertise and insight into this really amazing art form. But back to you guys. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you had fun. And we'll see you next time on Sight, Sound, and Story Live.
Bye-bye.
Bye.